Building on top of the Apache Software Foundation allows you to build software that you never could have built previously because you couldn't have afforded to build it yourself. You can really build much cooler and higher tech products than you ever could have before. My name is Andrew Lamb. I'm a staff engineer at InfluxData. I'm also on the Apache Arrow PMC. The PMC stands for Program Management Committee, which is the governing structure of the Apache Arrow project. So the Apache Software Foundation is a US nonprofit company that was set up in order to sustain and provide governance structure for open source projects. And so now it has several hundred open source projects that follow the same governance structure. Specifically what the Apache Software Foundation provides is it provides a set of rules called the Apache Way. They're really guidelines. There are certain things that are required, but it's actually relatively small. I think it's much more the higher level philosophy. So it starts with all the software is licensed with something called the Apache software license, which hasn't changed in 20 years. It's very stable, and it's very clear what you can do with the software, and it's basically you can do anything that you want other than use the Apache name. And there's a very big emphasis on open communication. So basically, with the very few exceptions, everything that's done, both the Apache Software Foundation and the individual projects are open, right? So anyone on the internet can go read them. That's a key thing that takes a little getting used to when you first start working on these open source projects, but it's very, very powerful over time. So I've spent 20 years in enterprise software doing sort of classic enterprise software development, and then InfluxData is the first company that I spent a significant amount of time working on open source. If you talked to me prior to joining, I would have immediately imagined it works something like the Bodie McBoatface example, if you've ever heard of that, which is where the British government asked the internet to name one of their new research vessels, and the internet decided Bodie McBoatface would be the best choice, right? So that's an example of, like, I think the kind of thing I was imagining working on open source in the real world would end up looking like. Everyone can contribute, everything's public, so what you imagine is going to appear. It could be a lot of chaos, but actually it's far exceeded my expectations in terms of quality of the software, the people you interact with, their interactions, the communication. It's really quite phenomenal to be a part of. There's over 100 individual projects now, of one of which is Apache Arrow, and I think the fact that there are so many projects is very indicative of how well the process works and how well it can scale. So they've done a great job of finding the core pieces that are important to emphasize, but also then giving individual projects enough flexibility to run themselves the way they want to. Influx, since its beginning, has been a strong believer in open source, and ever since its earliest products, they've all been open source projects. However, they've mostly been driven by Influx itself. One of the shifts we've seen recently is now we're working with the larger Apache community, and I think one major benefit you get of that is you're able to attract more and more people to participate. The community could be much bigger. When Paul Dix, the co-founder, was looking to build the new product, he looked around, and I think he basically saw a variety of technologies that he would like to use to build that, but he's also then very well aware how expensive it would be to build those by himself, right? Like the type of team he would need to build, the amount of time he would have to invest. So I think he looked around at what were the open source projects that he could build his new product on top of. So he wrote a blog post in 2020, which now looks very prescient. I don't know if it sounded kind of crazy at the time, which he basically said, hey, this collection of open source technologies, specifically Arrow, Aeroflight, Parquet, using these technologies, we can build the type of engine I really want for my company, but we don't have to build it ourselves. So presumably that was some part of his ability to execute that, right? So with a very small team, we were then able to go build a new version of the product that we never would have been able to afford with the same size team. When we got started with Arrow, I think the core libraries were in a pretty strong state. There was a good C++ implementation and Python and Java. There was fairly mature implementations in a bunch of languages, and there was an implementation in Rust, which is the language Paul chose to build InfluxDB 3.0 in, but it was lagging behind the other implementations. We spent a lot of time investing in helping the Rust implementation catch up to the other language implementations. And in addition, we spent a lot of time investing in DataFusion and the Parquet reader in Rust as well. So I think there was a very strong foundation and the basics in place. So like we, Influx, didn't start any of these projects directly ourselves. We started working on them when they were relatively young and immature, and we've invested a lot of time both directly in helping mature them, but also in the overarching structures to help drive the projects forward. I mean, it sounds very boring, writing tickets or whatever, but it's very exciting to actually describe sort of what you think some people would like out of the software and then have someone else come up and do it for you. Like there's been time and time again where I file a ticket and within Like sometimes even within an hour, someone else will have said, hey, no, I'm going to work on this, and they'll have code ready. You've seen over the last 20 years a huge increase in the number of open source pieces of software that underlie your daily life. You go check your car and you look at the list of licenses or whatever, you'll see there's like a huge raft of open source software that underlies all that. Your car, your TV, basically everything. And it's the same with just software online as well. Basically every piece of software is like that now. The reason that those pieces of software can exist is because there's organizations like Apache that are able to find a way for many organizations to collaborate and build things together. The benefit for all of us is that things get better, faster, cheaper. Right? If everyone had to rebuild the entire software stack from the ground up every time they built something, you wouldn't have the types of things you take for granted now because it'd just be far too costly to do so. Only the biggest corporations would be able to afford it. So working with the Apache Software Foundation and other open source projects is a great way to find projects that fit your interests, right, with a like-minded community of people across the world. Previously, you would have had to work at a company, right, that specialized on these technologies, but now that you're able to find and contribute in a meaningful way to an open source project that everyone's working on together, I think is truly enlightening.